In a week when we're focusing on elections, we begin with a campaign that's been blown to smithereens. Joe Biden's, the debate that changed everything, and where the story in the U.S. goes from here. France appears set to usher in a new far-right government. The media there have played no small part in that. And there's a change of government in the United Kingdom. But what will the papers say? It may go down in political history as one of those dates that Americans will always remember. June 27th, 2024, the day U.S. politics blew up over President Joe Biden's disastrous performance debating Donald Trump. Biden showed voters who he really is, what he has become at age 81, etching questions about his cognitive capabilities into the public consciousness where they will remain until November's election if he is still on the ballot. The Biden campaign is in a state of panic. His backers say he's not going anywhere. But more and more Democratic sources now want him out, retired. The role played by the U.S. mainstream media in this story has been central, even causal. Liberal outlets out to stop Trump at any cost, downplayed or ignored warning signs about Biden's aging that were abundant. Their credibility in shreds, they've now changed their tune, joining the conservative platforms and independent alt-media voices that have been on this story throughout. However, the failure of so many mainstream outlets, 3 years of it, to properly scrutinize Joe Biden has helped land the U.S. where it finds itself today, with a president whose ability to do the job is on everybody's mind.
The president's campaign is in full-scale damage control mode, trying to stop the bleeding after that debate performance.
But he had a test to meet tonight to restore confidence of the country and of the base, and he failed to do that.
Like if this was a family member and you watch this, you would go to Dad and say, Dad, we need to take the keys away from you now.
Look beyond the chaos and confusion of a story that has captivated Washington, and you will find elements that go to the core of the state of America's vaunted democracy and the way politics there are reported. Starting with the herd mentality of the White House press corps. It spent most of President Joe Biden's first term shying away from a topic that was all over social media, the unmistakable signs of Biden's cognitive decline.
He is sharp, intensely probing, and detail-oriented and focused.
Followed last week by that herd shifting after Biden's disastrous performance at a debate watched by 51 million people, the liberal commentariat finally admitting the obvious, now lining up, calling for him to stand aside. Along with the New York Times, just a few months ago, the Times had a columnist taking the Biden aging story and stylizing it. Within 24 hours of the debate, the paper's editorial team agreed it is time for this president to go.
The most kind of brazen about faces come from Joe Scabra at MSNBC's Morning Joe. Scabra just 3 months ago said that he had spoken with Biden.
He's far beyond cogent. In fact, I think he's better than he's ever been.
3 months later, he is on TV telling people that maybe the president needs to step down.
I fear Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States unless things change.
So this is a pretty stunning, and I would say delegitimizing incident for the press, which you might say was complicit in keeping the public in the dark.
They were hoping that the debate would help counter the concerns of Biden's age and his cognitive abilities.
Excuse me, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if
liberal commentators, they can't really counteract that particular argument. Only Biden himself can effectively dismantle those concerns through his own performance, which he completely failed to do. And so liberal commentators were confronted now with this real crisis.
The instant the country saw the debate, it became too obvious to ignore. For those media outlets, it became embarrassing to them.
He was incapable of doing better than he was, and you can't come back from that.
It's sort of the emperor has no clothes moment. You can't continue to say, no, the emperor does have clothes. It's like, we all saw what we saw, and the media is complicit, certainly, in hiding this issue.
The speed with which liberal mainstream outlets turned on this story, detaching themselves from this president, has dropped jaws across the U.S. That U-turn has been seized upon by conservatives at places like Fox News that have been fixated on the Biden aging story for years.
Now they're asking the same question. They don't remember that we know that they sat on their hands.
There was a time in 2019 when liberal outlets talked about Biden's mental condition openly when he was still seeking the Democratic nomination.
The question is, does he still have his stuff? How sharp is he?
But once Biden became the nominee and then took the reins of power, that changed. Even though the clues kept coming, the momentary lapses, Biden's staff keeping his public appearances to a bare minimum, questions about his cognitive capabilities largely went away.
He's actually perfectly sharp. He's up to the job.
Most of what Americans were seeing of the story was not journalism. It was a closing of the ranks.
It was almost as if a curtain just came down and this topic was banned from discussion.
More wild speculation from a bunch of people who have probably never been in a room with Joe Biden and certainly don't have medical degrees that I'm aware of.
It also reflects a shift since 2016, since Trump's election, where a lot of the media looked at the way that they're reporting, completely accurate reporting, on Hillary Clinton's scandals, ultimately helped put Trump in the White House. And what they decided was certain facts are just too sensitive to tell the public, which cannot always be trusted to make the right decision.
This is not necessarily unique to the Biden administration. This is just how Washington works. In order to get big stories, in order to get scoops, you have to have access. And in order to maintain access, you can't piss off the people who you're covering. And only when it's unavoidable, like it became on Thursday night, that's when you see people changing their tune because they know that they won't be outcast anymore because everyone is doing it at the same time.
It's undeniable that there are major media outlets in this country that first and foremost worship power, that elite media follows its own circle. It's like a gravitational pull of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And typically, what's not acceptable in elite media consensus in the United States is to ask uncomfortable questions of power. What's been interesting about this moment is that I have never seen elite media consensus change so quickly.
We have talked a lot here over the years about Joe Biden's age.
If Joe Biden's cognitive condition was the elephant in the room, then American alternative news outlets were the canaries in the coal mine, detecting and reporting on the dangers of this story.
Anyone who says that his, mental health is totally fine and, there isn't a decline, there is lying.
Unlike the mainstream media, where Fox has ideological reasons to focus on Biden's age issues, it's been liberal voices leading the way online, attracting voters fearful of putting such a flawed, aging candidate up against Donald Trump come November.
That's been part of sort of the underlying criticism of mainstream media forever. It ignores the burgeoning group of voters, people disenchanted with politics. This is when you see rise of independent news outlets like my own and many others trying to get outside of that media ecosystem where you can only do good journalism if you appease your sources and you maintain that access.
We are in such a fragmented information environment. For the candidates, it's an additional challenge because they no longer have the ability to control the story the way they used to when they worked with the mainstream 3 news stations and print outlets to help drive a particular story. The public is hearing these different opinions and perspectives, and each does contribute to the way the public thinks about the presidency and who is the best person to lead.
CNN is one of the liberal-leaning news outlets that tended to avoid covering the president's age-related issues. Now, one of its mainstay anchors, Jake Tapper, has declared his network is all in on this story, despite the Orwellian messaging coming out of the White House.
The spinning is all very reminiscent of the George Orwell quote from the book 1984. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. We're not going to do that today on The Lead. We're going to talk on it.
In other words, we will stay on a story that CNN has barely touched for the past 3 years. The vast majority of the coverage now comes with the inevitable horse race angle. What does this mean for the upcoming election? If Biden, who insists he's not going anywhere, is not there to fight it, who will the Democratic candidate be? Not nearly enough of the coverage has been in the now. With catastrophic wars ongoing in Ukraine and in Gaza, what effect is Biden's aging having on those conflicts, on the victims?
The president has phone calls with Benjamin Netanyahu, reportedly pushing him to change course, and the Israeli Prime Minister simply dismisses him. And as you watch Trump humiliating Biden on stage, you have to wonder, is Netanyahu, who is known for being a masterclass manipulator, is he taking advantage of a president who is not at his best faculties to continue this horrendous war? A candidate that appears to not even be able to execute the duties of the presidency competently, who functions best from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. reportedly. Unfortunately, many of the world's crises do not happen in that 6-hour window.
To France now, where Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party is on the verge of an historic victory after a convincing win in the first round of elections. The party's rise has been fueled by some favorable coverage from French media outlets that have been shifting to the right for years now. Tariq Nafi is here with more.
France's far-right National Rally are on track to become the largest party in the election runoff this weekend. If left-wing and centrist parties are unable to form a front against it, Marine Le Pen's protégé, 28-year-old Jordan Bardella, could be France's next prime minister. Bardella is a relative newcomer to French politics, but is no overnight success story. His rise is in part thanks to business tycoon turned media mogul Vincent Bolloré. The billionaire owns an array of right-wing TV channels, radio stations and print outlets, which have given Bardella and his party huge media exposure, regularly pushing their far-right talking points.
Tout ce qu'a orchestré la gauche pour contrer le Rassemblement national, SOS racisme, touche pas à mon pote, etc., a paralysé tout discours contre l'immigration.
Arcom, France's broadcast media regulator, has issued multiple fines and warnings to Bolloré's outlets for inflammatory content and lack of balance.
Racisme en France, bien sûr. Oui, il y a du racisme en France. Comme partout. Et à gauche comme à droite. Et il y a du racisme anti-blanc aussi.
But it's unlikely to disrupt what has proven to be a very profitable business model for Bolloré. And the media's normalization of Bardella is happening across the mainstream media, what many called the Bollorization of the news. Most French TV outlets have shown a greater willingness to understand far-right voters than they have to scrutinize the racist policies of the parties themselves.
Par rapport à 11 millions d'électeurs que vous traitez de fascistes.
Mais je les traite pas de fascistes.
There's also the issue of the airtime Bardella gets, more than any other candidate, according to monitoring groups, and it's not even close. If the National Rally does end up in government, it would have been a victory secured in part by France's Fourth Estate.
Thanks, Tariq. Staying with France, a country that over the centuries has turned political protest into an art form. That may be a cliche, but it's one with elements of truth to it. Whether it's the cost of living, pension reforms, or the rise of the far right, the French know how to mobilize en masse to demand political change. It is a tradition that goes back to the French Revolution, a willingness to revolt against the country's elites that has never gone away. What makes France's protest culture unique, however, beyond the frequency of the demonstrations, is the success rate and the love of literature that's on display on the streets. Puns and poetry used to make a political point. The Listening Post's Johanna Hoos now on France's revolutionary spirit and one French demonstrator whose commitment to protests sets him apart.
Ce qui m'a poussé à choisir cette vie de protestataire, c'est un sentiment de, comment je dis maintenant, de révolte millénaire par rapport au fait que tous les peuples, dans tous les siècles, sont méprisés par leurs dirigeants. On leur marche dessus. Donc quelque part, quand je porte mes grands panneaux, c'est comme un cri dans tous les siècles. Je ressens ça à travers moi et je porte leur souffrance, leurs cris.
For retired school teacher Jean-Baptiste Redé, many of his days over the past decade have been something like this. Travel to Paris carrying along cardboard and markers, design a protest sign and join those out on the streets. From climate change and pension reform to France's minimum wage and the situation in the Middle East, Redé is out on the front lines. At nearly 2 meters tall, his towering presence has become as iconic as his protest posters. How many demos he has attended? Redé says he is simply not keeping count.
Quand on lutte, c'est comme quand on aime.
Protesting is like loving. You can't put a number on it. I don't count, I just go. I usually prepare my signs before the protest, in a cafe or even on the street if I'm running late.
Je rumine en moi le slogan.
I think long and hard about the most catchy slogan. And all the causes I care about are connected. Social and climate justice, world peace and respect for human and animal rights. It's all close to my heart and all linked. I strive towards harmony. In a country known for its protest culture, Redé, who goes by an alias Volchouin, inspired by French literature, is one of its most dedicated demonstrators. He often features in national and international media, has his own Wikipedia page, and his colourful signs have even made it into France's school history books. According to France's Public Order and Traffic Department, on average, there's a protest in Paris every 4 hours. The country's penchant for protest may be a stereotype, but it reflects a dedication to dissent that is ingrained in the country's history.
In France, it really is an intrinsic part of political culture. There's a sense that politics isn't something that just happens within formal institutions, that people can make their voices heard, that they have a role to play in political life. And episodes of protest have really punctuated French history and brought about very important change. But really, the pivotal event in defining France's tradition of protest is the French Revolution of 1789, an act of mass protest against the monarchy. And it is really out of this act of protest that the modern French democratic system has emerged.
Our political tradition is extremely confrontational. And it might come from the absolute monarchy, people like Louis XIV in the 17th century, establishing the idea that the king really has all power. And even though we overthrew the king, our presidential regime, which is not supposed to be that, but it is actually that, means that there's a confrontation between a kind of absolute monarch on one side and the people on the other one, so that there's very few agent of transmission between those two bodies, except for protest.
One of the most powerful standoffs between France's president and the people came to a head in May 1968.
Basically, I think a lot of people now do want revolution. They want to change the system.
Disillusioned with the conservative, patriarchal and autocratic rule of Charles de Gaulle, a former general who'd been in power for nearly 10 years, students at university campuses sparked an uprising that soon spread to factories around the country. Mass, at times violent protests morphed into general strikes, at its peak involving some 10 million workers. The revolt paralyzed France's economy for weeks, nearly brought down the government, and would irreversibly transform French society. The École des Beaux-Arts, School of Fine Arts here in Paris, was at the heart of the May '68 uprising. In an attempt to upend the old order, students and teachers turned this prestigious art school into a workshop, the Atelier Populaire, tasked with designing protest posters. The aim was to print the revolution, to use art as a tool to organize and galvanize the masses. Those posters have since become a symbol of France's protest culture. Their slogans, designs, continue to inspire activist movements to this day.
Over 2,000 posters were produced at the École des Beaux-Arts every day, and students went out and they stuck them on lampposts, on walls and buildings across Paris. And they were an important medium of communication. At the time, much of the French media was controlled by the state. And so the posters, I suppose it would be the equivalent of social media today. A lot of the posters derided the state. Many of the posters depict symbols of the workers' struggle. The students rejected the idea that their posters were art. They described them as weapons in the service of a struggle.
There was an ongoing idea that avant-garde art was made to change society. One of the interesting things is that many major artists of the time, like Roulier-Le-Parc or Bernard Rancillac, did some posters without signing them. And a lot of writers also went on doing the slogans. So it was this collective thing. And I think it made also for the quality of what was produced. A lot of what you see around us today in the world of protest in France is steeped into the imagery and model of what happened at the Atelier Populaire des Beaux-Arts in May '68.
Et donc c'est très important ce mouvement pour moi.
This movement is very important to me, even though I was too young to participate in '68. I still experience the consequences. I still remember the posters. There was a lot of humor in the art, and some slogans have become quite famous, like "It's forbidden to forbid." The slogans were short and catchy, and some of them are still used on the streets today, as since '68, protests have seldomly stopped.
Des révoltes.
Whilst the spirit of '68 lives on France's streets, art no longer plays the same role it did in protest decades ago. The internet and the liberalization of the French media means activists no longer need posters to rally the people or get their word out. But arresting protest art still serves a powerful, invisible purpose: to pointedly deliver a political message to government, which the French, having a way with words, know how to do like no other.
There's a lot of self-critical, critical, irony aspects that is really ingrained in traditions. Untranslatable play on words is one of them. And there's always this kind of, I don't know, romanticism when you do a protest in the street of Paris. You connect with earlier protests in the streets of Paris, like Liberty Guiding the People by Delacroix, this painting from 1830, something that is the very embodiment of the French spirit.
Et c'est vrai que dans la rue, on voit aussi pas mal d'artistes qui font.
It's true that in the streets, there are a lot of artists who use music, words, and visual art to express themselves at protests. I find it inspiring, as it's this collective that makes us succeed.
Et ce qui me choque, c'est que.
But what shocks me is how few of us are out on the streets. Never have our struggles been so urgent. Climate change, social justice, world peace. We are on the brink of profound danger that threatens us all. And still, there are not enough of us.
Et on n'est pas assez nombreux.
And finally, in this year of so many elections, another country just wrapped one up. The United Kingdom has a new ruling party, Labour, and a new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. There was never any doubt that the Conservative Party, which had been in government for 14 years, would get trounced. Its time in power resulted in Brexit, the messy divorce from the European Union, deep cuts to government spending, especially to social welfare, the inept and corrupt handling of COVID-19, and some serious damage to the UK's public broadcaster, the BBC. The Conservatives targeted the network's funding and oversaw a media space that grew more polarized, more toxic on their watch on issues such as immigration and inequality. We'll be keeping an eye on the UK media, particularly its print sector, 70% of which leans to the right. Starmer will be under no illusions. Some of those papers, owned by conservative billionaires, will be coming for him. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.